This is episode 70 with Registered Dietitian specializing in the treatment of eating disorders and emotional eating, and 307 marathoner Annyck Besso. Welcome to the Strength Running Podcast. This is your host, Jason Fitzgerald, and I can't believe we are now at episode 70 of the podcast. Wow, what a ride it has been since this whole project started back in 2016, and I have you to thank for that. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting our sponsors. Thank you for sharing the pod with your friends. And of course, thank you for all the reviews and ratings. They truly matter and really do make my day. I never thought that 2 years ago that this podcast would allow me to connect with so many different runners and other coaches and authors and scientists and researchers who all help us make better decisions with our training. It's really rewarding for me, and I hope that our next 70 shows are just as helpful for you. Okay, so since I seem to be on a thank you tour, I also want to thank our sponsor, Inside Tracker, for making this show possible. If you don't know Inside Tracker, and I'd be quite surprised if you didn't, they allow any runner to test their body for hormonal or other types of deficiencies so that you can then correct them, which then allows you to train more effectively, recover more quickly, and race faster. Go on over to InsideTracker.com and use code STRENGTHRUNNING, no space, it's all one word, to save 10% on any test that they offer, including their affordable do-it-yourself and essentials kits if you're on a budget. Don't miss this opportunity to optimize your training and recovery to reach your potential. Their site is InsideTracker.com, and the code, one more time, is STRENGTHRUNNING. That will save you 10% on any test they have. All right, moving on. Our guest today is Annyck Besso, and we're talking about an important and sensitive topic, eating disorders in the running community. It's a reality that our sport favors those with thin frames, but I think that often drives runners to chase unrealistic body shapes or have an unhealthy relationship with food. And for myself, being on a cross-country and track team at the college level for 4 years, I've experienced seeing some of my friends battle eating disorders. It's very real, and it's something that I think we should talk about. So Annyck is coming on to help us better understand this issue and give us some concrete steps to take if we're suffering or someone we know develops disordered eating. Annyck got her bachelor's degree in nutrition and dietetics from St. Francis Xavier University and then earned a master's degree from McGill in dietetics. She's worked on an inpatient and outpatient pediatric unit at the Douglas Mental Health University Institute, a renowned psychiatric hospital in Canada. She's also received specialty training in evidence-based approaches such as cognitive behavioral therapy, family-based treatment, and dialectical behavioral therapy. This is a conversation we all should be having with ourselves, with our loved ones, and with those who might be at risk. I hope it's helpful for you. Please welcome Miss Annyck Besso. Annyck, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Jason.
Well, this is going to be a real treat. We're going to talk about an important topic today. I think before we dive in, though, I just want to give you a quick plug and shout out here on the podcast. You are quite the fast runner. You recently ran, I think, 3:07 in the marathon. You ran 20:08 in a 5K earlier this year. And it'd be remiss for me not to mention that when you ran that 3:07 at the Wisconsin Marathon, you came in second. So you were the second woman overall finisher. So that's really fast. Congratulations. And I'm just stoked to have a registered dietitian who's a really fast runner on the podcast today.
Thanks, Jason. I do have to say I came third, which is, still a great feat. I do also have to say that Wisconsin Marathon was not the marathon we were hoping for this year. It was actually about 80 degrees during the marathon. So it was a nice mental challenge. So I do feel very happy. Thank you.
Wow. 80 degrees is clearly suboptimal conditions for the marathon. Can I ask you, what is your marathon PR? If you ran 3:07 in 80 degree weather, I can only imagine what you're capable of in ideal conditions.
Yeah, so actually only run 2 marathons. My first marathon was the Toronto Waterfront Marathon in 2014, and I ran a 3:10. And then, unfortunately, I had some very bad luck skiing and I tore my ACL. So that kind of put me out of marathon training for a few years. And Wisconsin, I was hoping for a sub 3 hour, which was a very ambitious goal, but that was my PR actually. So very happy with the 3:07.
Now, did you run in college?
I actually didn't run in college. No, I was kind of intimidated to run in college for a team, but I did a master's at McGill and I trained with a group that at the time was called McGill Olympic. Now it's called Athlétisme Ville-Marie. And our coach, John LaFranco, he trains a lot of like post varsity athletes. So I got a chance to run with a lot of really fast people and really get some good training. So
That's awesome. So you clearly have to try for that sub 3 your next time around. Do you have a marathon coming up soon?
yes, actually. So the sub 3, hopefully, fingers crossed, will be in December in Sacramento. I hear it's a good one to try to PR on too.
That's awesome. Well, congratulations on the 3:07. That's a really fast time in pretty poor conditions. And best of luck going after that sub 3. That's really exciting. Yeah, let's dive into our topic for the day. You contacted me a few weeks ago to come on the podcast. And after a long debate that took about 2.5 seconds, I said yes, because I think the topic that you want to discuss, which is disordered eating, is really important. And I think first, maybe I should issue a bit of a disclaimer. I think it would be helpful for our listeners to know my experience with the topic. I've never had an eating disorder, so I'm not really going to be able to talk about this from my own perspective. But I did run cross country, indoor and outdoor track at the collegiate level. And at that level, eating disorders are unfortunately somewhat common. You know, I have friends who have eating disorders. Some of my teammates have suffered stress fractures while having an eating disorder, which I think, as many know, is an all too common result of simply not eating enough. And it's becoming more clear that a lot of runners, both men and women, are dealing with body image issues, disordered eating, and the consequences that inevitably result. So, I'm really approaching this topic as someone who wants to further understand it and hopefully spread some helpful, non-judgmental advice and resources to those who might be suffering from disordered eating. So maybe we can start by you kind of explaining what disordered eating is, and maybe if there is a difference between disordered eating and having an eating disorder.
Yeah, so I would say that, disordered eating kind of presents itself on a spectrum, and there is a difference between disordered eating and an eating disorder. There are obviously different types of eating disorders, and those are really diagnosed with the DSM-5 by a mental health specialist. But, disordered eating can also present itself in many forms, and these people also tend to suffer very, very much. So when one becomes so preoccupied with food and their body shape and weight that it affects other parts of their life. So activities, going out to eat with friends, it creates a certain amount of distress if there's things that are unpredictable. So I don't know, you show up at practice and somebody brought donuts, then, there's this like anxiety, and it can really, really affect that time. And you kind of want to avoid situations like that. So there's a very strong need for control. And a lot of times I would say the main thing with disordered eating is that the food choices are really seen as like good and bad, which would then affect your perception of yourself. So now I'm this terrible person that has no self-control because I went to practice and I told myself that I wouldn't have the donut and I just wasn't able to resist and I had the donut anyways. I can't believe this. I really need to do better, try harder, and I can't believe how bad I've done. So there's a lot of judgments about yourself as a person, your success, your self-worth based on weight, body shape or the foods that you eat per se.
So is an eating disorder a mental illness?
Yes, it is.
Okay, I learned something. I think that's important to know.
And I would say actually an important point to clarify is that a lot of people think that eating disorders are, I would say in like society, we know eating disorders as anorexia, whereas there's a lot of different types of eating disorders. And a lot of people think that it's a superficial illness, that people want to look a certain way and eat certain foods. And what we know is that eating disorders, sure, like the symptoms do come out in terms of body shape, weight, and food choices, but it really is a disorder about control and emotion regulation. So I think that's an important point to clarify.
Now, speaking of emotions, is emotional eating different in any way than disordered eating?
Yeah, so I would say emotional eating can be a form of disordered eating. So, there emotional eating again, you can find it on a spectrum. Emotional eating versus binge eating, there is a very much like a difference. So, emotional eating could be like I had a really hard day at work and I deserve this bowl of ice cream, and then I eat the bowl of ice cream and I feel guilty about it, and maybe I'll do something to manage that guilt, or I'll just kind of like move on in my day. And obviously that can present itself like on a spectrum. Binge eating, however, is, I often say that people that suffer from binge eating, they have a lot of physical vulnerabilities because they're people that tend to chronically restrict and diet. And so your body is pretty much trying to regulate that by sending you signals that will make you crave like high sugar, high fat foods. And so the binge would typically occur like later in the day. And in order to be, I guess, qualified as a binge, there has to be a perceived loss of control. So really, you feel like the decisions you're making with food are kind of outside of you. And then the way I describe it is kind of like you snap out of it and you're like, oh my goodness, I can't believe how much I ate. So binge eating, you can eat like a very large amount of food, which would be an objective binge, but then you could also eat like a pretty normal amount of food, but have this perception of losing control, which would be considered a subjective binge.
Okay, so I'm kind of putting on my coach's hat right now and thinking about, the particular type of athlete or groups of athletes that might be more susceptible to disordered eating. In your experience, are there particular types or groups of athletes that are more likely to have an eating disorder than others?
Yeah, I would say, and obviously there's exceptions to every rule, but just based on the people I see, I would say that athletes that are more susceptible there's a category of, sports that aesthetics is very much like appreciated and is important. So sports like ballet, bodybuilding, or gymnastics, there's like pressure to look a certain way, and the way you look is really a lot part of like whether you're chosen and the competition and the performance per se. And I would say the other category is sports where weight does affect performance. So wrestling, there's a lot of trying to manage your weight to be in a certain weight category. And unfortunately, running, we do know that weight can affect your speed, but I really tread lightly in that area because I think that when coaches try to signal to their athletes that they can have control over their weight, which would then lead to higher performances, I think sometimes we're unaware how fast that can really spiral and actually negatively affect performance, in my experience.
Yeah, I've, growing up on a team for 8 years, 3 seasons a year, I was exposed to a lot of runners, men and women, who really wanted to have that runner's body. And they unfortunately went through some very unhealthy ways to try to get that. And then, from the coaching side, I have unfortunately had some coaches who made comments about runners' weight and how they look and how being lighter is generally associated with being faster. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it's kind of like this really tough balance to strike where you're right. If you are at a lower weight, provided that it's a healthy weight for you, then you're going to race faster than if you were 10 or 20 pounds heavier. Now, the slippery slope there is that lighter does not necessarily mean better, because if you pursue that goal without any regard to the consequences or how that's going to affect how you feel, how you recover, how you perform, then all those things are going to start to suffer. You are going to experience performance declines. You are going to experience a very real and substantial higher risk of injury because of calorie restriction. And so when I'm thinking about this issue as a coach, I really want to make sure that I'm speaking to my athletes in such a way that is not going to lead them down this path. And maybe Annyck, you can give some examples from your experience and how a coach might be able to foster an environment that is not focused on exactly how you look or your weight or your body shape. How can us coaches deal with this issue a little bit more effectively?
Well, to me, what I often tell, some of my clients that are runners is that a body does respond naturally to training. So, in marathon training, your body would typically be a bit lighter just because of the mileage without you really having to control your intake in any way. I know from my experience with John and the group at Athletics Ville-Marie, it's that, he never really talks about body shape or size and really talks about like our desire and our passion to run. So if you want to run better and perform more, of course you have to like prioritize that in your life, and you need to fuel during your long runs. And yeah, maybe when you come home, eating a bag of chips wouldn't be the best for recovery. But I think kind of sending the message that you're fueling your body so that you can recover and you can perform because you love to run and you work so hard to run that you might as well put all the chances on your side, but never really with a focus on like weight and body shape per se.
Right. That's super important. I remember one coach after summer base training for cross country asking another member of the team if he had actually done his summer training, because he showed up and is admittedly a friend of mine who doesn't have the typical runner body. And, after practice, when my friend would kind of, would go elsewhere, the coach would ask us, hey, is this runner drink a lot of beer? Is that why he doesn't look the way that most of the other guys look on the team? And we actually had to tell the coach, no, actually, he doesn't drink beer much at all. He runs just as much as all of us do. And that's just the way that his body is shaped. And, he goes on to like wipe the floor with most of the team when it comes to workouts and races. So, clearly body shape isn't everything. So yeah, I thank you for that, for the kind of helpful way of thinking about talking about running without overly focusing on, your body shape or your weight. Now, the other kind of related question I have for you is, now I have 3 kids, and it's my job as a parent to ask, I think, if there's anything I can do to lower the risk that one of my children develops an eating disorder. What can I do as a parent?
So that's a tough one, Jason, because we know from the literature that we don't know what the cause of eating disorders are per se. We know that genetically there could be biological vulnerabilities, and then there's environmental factors, so experiences in someone's life that could make them more susceptible to developing an eating disorder. But one thing I can say to parents is that I see a lot in my practice, these parents that have had their own experience with like food and their bodies, and they really they really mean well, but they start trying to, restrict certain foods from the household. There's a lot of talk about like other people's weight. Oh, like Aunt Susan, she lost 20 pounds, like she looks great. Or, oh my gosh, mom feels so fat. Mom looks so bad. And so I guess if I could give advice to parents, it would be, let's not talk about weight and body shapes in the household in terms of looks, and let's instead talk about like, taking care of your body, and you look so healthy, you look glowing, like, wow, wouldn't it be so nice to get outside to move, to like be in the sun and get those endorphins, instead of, well, you really need to move because if not, you'll gain weight. A dietitian that I really like and use in my work with children and adolescents, her name is Ellen Satter. And one of her recommendations is that, as parents, we are responsible for like the what, when, and where of feeding, but the child can really determine like how much and whether to eat or not. So it's very different from, I know the way my parents raised me, we were told to finish everything that was on our plate. And if we didn't eat our vegetables, then we didn't get dessert. But that kind of makes dessert this very like novel and special thing. And oftentimes kids will then associate that with like happiness and joy. So then in adulthood, it's like, well, when I feel happy or when I feel sad, I automatically want dessert. So I guess to kind of summarize that, it would be to try to not like mention your child's like weight or shape, and trust that like, the body really does have like a natural spot where it wants to sit. And if we don't control that, usually it does a really good job at, taking care of itself. And then also, having the mentality that all foods fit. And sure, you can provide your kids with like, I don't know, like a balanced meal of like grains and protein and vegetable. But then if your kid also wants like a bowl of ice cream after dinner, then kind of sending the message that that's okay.
Yeah, so that's what I'm struggling with right now, because I have a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and our 9-month-old is not eating ice cream or cookies just yet. But, 3 and 5, they've been exposed to all this junk food over the last couple of years, even though we try to, just limit their exposure to it as much as we can, because there's just other more beneficial foods to be eaten. But at the same time, I want them to be able to go out for an ice cream in the summertime after dinner or something like that. How do we kind of keep junk food in its rightful place as an occasional treat that's okay to have, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but at the same time recognizing that it is occasional, that it is something that should not replace healthy, real food. And I guess what I struggle with in this issue here with kids is that, this junk food should not be a treat, but it is. And how do we rectify that?
Yeah, it's a really hard one. And I do have to admit that it's something I find difficult even in my practice, because parents, you don't want to like control too much, because then you can kind of push the child the other way. But, they're also children. So they don't necessarily have this ability to make the choices and understand what that means. Often what I recommend is, having these foods available as snacks. So not the chips and the cookies that, the kids will just go to, having like, I don't know, fresh fruit and peanut butter and nuts and vegetables and hummus and all those kinds of foods that are very nutrient dense. But then, going out for ice cream after dinner in the summer and having, a good time as a family without mentioning, oh, this is a treat and this is a fun food. It's just, now we're doing this. And so I think children, they crave these like sweet foods. And because they're not really nutrient dense, they're not very filling. So if you come home and like eat 4 Oreos from school, you're going to be really hungry 30 minutes later and you're going to want 4 more Oreos. So, but if you come home and like what the snack is like, an apple with peanut butter and some nuts or a yogurt, then it's kind of like, okay, well, now I'm full until dinner, and maybe after dinner I can have like my 2 Oreos. So I always try to kind of recommend that it's like, well, let's get the nutrition in. So let's feed the kid like a really like nutritious meal. And then if you add the Oreo to that, it's not really a big deal. But that's not where they're getting their primary source of nutrition.
I like that. That's a good compromise, and one that I think my wife and I do a decent job at, but there's always room for improvement, and I think we're going to keep working at it. Let's get back to runners and eating disorders, because, clearly it's not productive for a runner to be performance-minded, for someone who wants to get faster or run longer to, have this kind of an illness. So what are some of the physical effects of disordered eating, and then how does that affect your running performance?
Yeah, so I mean, unfortunately, I think there are a lot of physical effects that can't necessarily be seen. So, we often think of disordered eating as presenting itself as like a low body weight, but a lot of the effects that can happen in a normal sized body as well. So often a big motivator for the runners I work with is that I'm like, if you're running, I don't know, let's say 6 miles, and you're not fueling and you're restricting your energy intake, your body is going to use the energy you're giving it to protect its vital organs. So that's the heart, the brain, and kidneys, liver, all that jazz. But mainly the heart is going to be always the one that will trump everyone else. So if you're running your 6 miles and you've broken down a bit of muscle tissue, your body's not going to use that energy to rebuild that tissue. So you're really just harming yourself a bit more. So from that aspect, one thing that where it really affects runners is a decrease in endurance. Just I know so many runners that I've worked with that train for marathons, and they just bonk, at mile 15, mile 20. But just because part of their eating disorder is not taking in any fuel, because there's such a fear around that. But they're very determined, strong athletes, but because of this disorder, their performances are really suboptimal. So there's that. One very, very dangerous thing can be the heart. So, as runners, people are very, very proud of having lower heart rates, but it's also a symptom in eating disorders. So, it's kind of like, well, you have a low heart rate, but is that because you're not fueling it adequately or because you're in really, really good shape? So that can be dangerous. Also, if there's purging behaviors, I don't know if you're familiar with that, Jason, but it means that there is vomiting or laxative abuse as part of the eating disorder that can really dysregulate electrolytes in the body, and your heart uses electrolytes to beat. So people can have irregular heartbeats, and unfortunately in a marathon, obviously your heart is working hard in any race, any distance. So that makes me very nervous with some clients, and I will often recommend to not run the race. So that can also be one. And then, I don't know how much we want to go into this, but a big one that's very common in the running field is amenorrhea, so a loss of a period. Some adolescents actually don't even get their period, so it can be delayed. And that can have a lot of effects, obviously, on bone density, which could lead to osteopenia, and then that can lead later on to osteoporosis. So we can see women that are, 50 or 40 who have the bone density of an 80-year-old woman. And as you mentioned earlier in the podcast, stress fractures, injuries, these are things that I think runners just take as part of being a long distance runner. And it's really a common misconception that because you run a lot, it's okay to not have a period. It's actually extremely dangerous. And if you're fueling adequately, you should be getting a regular period. And in adolescence, what's really scary is that it can also affect their growth. So we can see a lot of stunting with their height. And because that's usually the time where they're growing, it's really important that we start refeeding right away so that they can start resuming the growth again. And usually once you reach kind of an adequate body weight, the menses would resume automatically. So I guess as like a coach, let's say, how you would see warning signs is that a lot of fatigue, probably decreased performance in workouts. People's moods also really shift. You can see that they're more irritable. Isolation as well. So a lot of people suffering from eating disorders will, kind of make excuses to skip out on social events around food. And a big one is obviously the injury. And, injuries happen in running, but I think it's the chronic injury that then raises a red flag of like, okay, well, something's going on that your body is not able to recover. Sometimes it happens in people that, they're not even deliberately trying to restrict. And then, we send them for blood work and it's like, oh, you have low iron or low B12, low calcium. And, just looking at their intakes, there's tweaks that you can make so that they're really getting enough energy and enough of those nutrients to sustain the level that they're running at.
Wow, there's a lot in there. Thank you so much for kind of going through everything and really laying it all out there. I think what we're learning here is that an eating disorder really is this full body illness that affects everything from your heart to your lungs to your potentially your muscles and bones. And that's really serious. And, we had on the podcast a while back, Tina Muir, I believe it was episode 31, talking about how she quit running so that she could finally get her period again. And, thankfully she ended up getting her period. She wanted to start a family. She ended up having a baby girl, and I just had her on again to help me with some coaching Q&A. And she was talking about how the baby's sleeping right now. And it's just great to hear that. And kind of her journey was a successful one. And, I think that's it's just really inspiring to hear and to know that, there is kind of a way out for runners who might be suffering from that. And then I think it's really interesting hearing you talk about, the energy availability that runners have and how this is all tied to the calories that you're consuming, the quality and quantity of those calories, and how if you are trying to run a lot or run hard, in other words, to train while having an eating disorder, the calories that you are consuming are really going to be used to protect your heart and your brain, and the training stress is not going to be addressed as much as it should be. I think it's really interesting too that a while back we profiled 9 elite runners and their favorite injury prevention strategies. And one of the runners, David Roche, he's a phenomenal trail runner here in Colorado. And his advice was to eat a lot. And I was like, what does this have to do with injury prevention? And his answer is that it's all about energy availability. If you want to be able to perform really well and give your body the necessary energy and materials to repair itself after a long run or a hard workout, or simply refuel and recover appropriately, then you need all that energy and materials, which is just another way of saying calories. I think that's just so helpful, and it really drives home the point that this is, kind of a global, entire body illness that is going to affect how your body works and how its relationship with running is inevitably going to suffer. Maybe this is a good point to ask, okay, if someone does have an eating disorder, if someone does have an unhealthy relationship with food, what's their first step? What should they do?
Yeah, so it's hard, right? Because it kind of depends on the severity, but what all the evidence would show is that the first step is to eat more, which sucks, obviously, because that's the hardest part of the eating disorder. But so the calorie restriction, like you just stated, it has such a detrimental effect on the body, but it also really, really affects the brain. So from a cognitive standpoint, what we see is that people that are, as they progress in their eating disorder and their restriction, they become more and more rigid and things become scarier and scarier. So the way that you would treat eating disorders is always through like a multidisciplinary approach, obviously through therapy and a medical doctor, sometimes a psychiatrist, and then a dietitian. But what we see is that therapy is actually not that effective if you're not fueling adequately. So if you're still malnourished, it's really hard for you to process like, okay, well, I had this emotion and that's what led to this. So the first line of treatment would be to eat more. And so if somebody's listening today and is like, well, how do I do that? That almost seems like so vague and impossible. Often where I start with clients is that, we kind of go through, well, what are you eating in a day right now? And where would be the safest spot to add? So a really easy one is to add, well, really easy. I say that with all reserve. If you're not eating snacks, to add snacks in your day, and that can be with safe food. So whatever feels the most comfortable. You don't have to go out and eat an ice cream right now. Some people say, I'm not ready to add snacks. That's just way too overwhelming. And then I have so many more times that I have to confront this relationship with food. And so I say, okay, well, are you ready to just increase portions at meals? So if you're right now like measuring your rice, could you, times that by 1.5 and have that quantity of rice and then have whatever else you're having just in a bit larger quantity. So I would always recommend to obviously seek professional help, but if you're not there yet, just trying to see, how you can slowly increase your intake. An app that I use with clients that I find super helpful is called Recovery Record. And it's this app where you can log your intake. It's not a calorie counter in any way. But what's really cool about it is that it will send you reminders like, hey, have you had your snack? Like maybe you should log it. And then in the app, it asks you like your hunger, and it goes through like a slew of emotions. Like, are you feeling sad, anxious, stressed, happy? Who did you eat with? What did you eat? And like, do you have any comments? And so for some people hate it because they're like, I really don't want to log this. But other people find it really helpful because you can start seeing a trend of like, oh, I was stressed and that made it harder to eat. And, just kind of looking at how your relationship with food really isn't always about the food and more about like the way you're managing your emotions.
Now, I'm sorry, the name of the app is
Recovery Record.
Recovery Record. Great. I'll put a link to that in the show notes for anyone listening to this. We can get that on the blog post on the Strength Running website. I think that's great. Look, any resources are going to be really helpful for folks battling this disorder because, this just reminds me of alcoholism. And if you're an alcoholic, it's easy to take all the alcohol out of your house and not be tempted anymore by that. But you can't do that with an eating disorder. You have to constantly be around the very thing that you have trouble consuming at kind of at a healthy level and have a good relationship with. And that to me just is such an extraordinary obstacle and hurdle to get over. And I don't have any good answers on how to deal with that. It's like someone trying to quit smoking who's required to have 4 cigarettes per day and not anymore. That it just makes it sound so exceedingly difficult to succeed. And so your advice was to get both like really practical advice when it comes to just eating more and then seeking some professional help. Do you think a psychiatrist is a good first stop for a runner or an athlete, or for that matter, anybody who might be suffering from an eating disorder?
So a psychiatrist is actually a doctor that would basically prescribe medication. So I think they can definitely be part of the treatment team, but I would suggest a psychologist, and I would also suggest a dietitian. What I've heard is that it's very, very hard to find a dietitian that specializes in eating disorders and, takes on like the psychological approach. So often, like clinics that specialize in treating eating disorders will have a dietitian on staff who is really specialized. And of course, there's room for the psychiatrist. But what we often see is that, the behaviors, the anxiety, and a lot of the comorbidities that will present with the eating disorder, some of them will subside once you refeed. So that's kind of great news because oftentimes our clients won't actually need medication. Some do, of course. I always say, medication is kind of like if you have a broken leg, you could technically walk on it and perhaps it will heal. It just might be a lot more painful and a lot longer. So you might as well, take the crutches, allow it to heal. And then that doesn't mean that you need them for life, right?
I see. Now, should we be looking for psychologists that have certifications in some other areas? Because I know you yourself have a bunch of different other trainings in addition to, your formal education. You have cognitive behavioral therapy, family-based treatment, dialectical behavioral therapy certifications. Are any of those helpful in this area?
Yeah, so I would say that probably the main lines of treatment right now in adolescence, the evidence-based treatment right now is family-based treatment. And then, in adults, what we would see is cognitive behavioral therapy. But for binge eating, there's a lot more evidence that is showing that for binge eating and bulimia, DBT, so dialectical behavioral therapy, is actually very helpful as well. So obviously, like, those are the areas that I'm trained in, and those are the areas that I know to be evidence-based treatment for these eating disorders. There's other ones, like there's ACT, which would be acceptance and commitment therapy. That also is one that is used for the treatment of eating disorders. And then, of course, you have intuitive eating that could be used for disordered eating. And I think that's probably it for the ones I can think about right now.
I think the two that stood out were cognitive behavioral therapy and family-based treatment. Can you give us the Cliff's Notes versions of what those two entail?
Yeah, so family-based treatment is actually a really tough one. So family-based treatment, actually, the dietitian, you're basically empowering parents to refeed their child. So it's a very, very different approach where you're not a professional telling your clients what to do. You're just kind of helping them come up with ideas and empowering them to believe that, they can refeed their child and save their life and they can become experts with the eating disorder. And that they know how to feed their child. So that's family-based treatment. And cognitive behavioral therapy it's very much trying to identify ineffective thought patterns and trying to check facts around them and trying to challenge them and redevelop kind of more effective ones. So an example could be, oh my gosh, I ate this granola bar when I planned not to. I'm such a disgusting human. No one will ever love me. I don't deserve to, be a part of this family. And so what the therapist would then do is kind of deconstruct that belief and try to look for facts that would challenge it and maybe try to develop a bit more flexibility and saying, okay, well, what are you feeling when you eat the granola bar? And are there facts that actually support that you're a disgusting human and that you don't deserve to be a part of this family?
Sounds like CBT could be used to really address any negative thought pattern that one might have in their life. And particularly, again, I'm putting on my coach's hat here and thinking, my goodness, for sports psychology issues, this could also be really helpful. Is CBT used for really a wide variety of other issues as well?
Yeah, CBT is used for a lot of different diagnoses. And something that could be cool if you want me to send over to you is just automatic cognitive distortions that I think probably all of us engage in, but it's a list. So you could maybe put it in the show notes, but sometimes when I show that to clients, they're like, oh, I have all of these. And I think we all have these at one point in time, but it's kind of nice to see, oh, these are actually like distortions. It's not necessarily factual.
I love that. Yes, I would very much appreciate any extra information or resources about really anything that we discussed here, because I'm going to put that into a big list of things and link all that up so that, if you're listening to this podcast on the blog, we're going to have a lot of those links available to you so that, if you actually do want to follow up on anything like that, it'll be right there for you. Annyck, thank you so much for lending your expertise and talking with me about this, really complex and sensitive issue. I think it deserves a little bit more attention here in the running community. I know I'm admittedly not the best person to speak on it. I'm not an expert. I don't have any experience on it. And maybe with that said, my last question for you can be, is there anything that I'm missing? Have we not discussed an important component to this topic that you think would be valuable to talk about?
I guess one thing I would just want to say is that a lot of people tend to invalidate their struggle based on their weight. And I want to say that, weight really isn't representative of how much someone is struggling. So if you do feel like food takes up a large part of your life and, you are really preoccupied with your body shape and your weight, no matter what weight you're at, then it might be helpful to, seek help or even do a bit more research on that, because you're really not alone. And I think sometimes people tend to have a lot of judgments about themselves. And, in sports teams, this whole idea of looking a certain way and so was so lucky because she was born with like a six pack, and all I want is that, because people won't consider me a real runner if I don't have that. That can very much affect someone and their perception of like fitting into a team. So sometimes it's kind of nice to reach out to either professionals or people that are close to you to challenge those thoughts and maybe get a bit more support and to tell you, like, really this is something that affects a large percentage of the population, and there really is great resources to help you. So that's a big one that I wanted to say.
Well, thank you for saying that. That was again very helpful, and I just want to thank you again for speaking to this issue in such an approachable way, in a way that really condensed a lot of information and a lot of helpful resources into a short period of time. This is one of those podcast episodes you want to listen to on half speed instead of at a faster speed.
Yeah.
But Annyck, where can folks learn more about you, connect with you, follow your work? Are you online anywhere?
Well, so I work at Mind Body Health, so I can send you the link for that website. Unfortunately, I don't really have anything else online professionally, which I know is shocking in this day and age. But I can also provide you with an email address that folks can. I'm happy if you'd like to reach out to me, and happy to answer some questions. But besides that, I don't have anything social media wise for for my work.
That's fine. Well, how about this? I'll link up your email address if you're so bold as to do that. And I'll do that in the blog post surrounding this podcast. And if folks do have specific questions for you, if they want to reach out, then I think it's really great that you're offering that as a resource for them. So thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me on your podcast, Jason. I listen to you weekly. I really look forward to your episodes. I find them really, really informative and varied. So it really does feel like an honor to be on your show. It feels kind of like being a superstar in a way.
Well, the only reason my podcast is so informative is because I have on amazing guests such as yourself to help our listenership.
Thank you.
Hey, it's Jason, and before you leave for today, I want to thank Annyck one more time for coming on the show and helping us with this difficult topic. I hope you'll forward this podcast to someone who might find it to be a valuable resource. Finally, are you a runner that wants to get better, to race faster, get injured less frequently, run further? Of course you are. Those are questions designed to make you say yes. And if so, of course, you're going to love our sponsor, Inside Tracker. They test over 40 different biomarkers like stress hormones to determine if you're training too hard, too little, or have any kind of physiological weaknesses that can be remedied by either diet, exercise, or lifestyle changes. So in other words, you learn about problems that then have actionable solutions. Inside Tracker uses blood testing to get this information, and then they communicate what you can do to lift or lower your results into an optimal range that's unique to you. For any runner who wants every advantage to see what they're truly capable of achieving, I highly recommend Inside Tracker. And I'm not just a spokesman, I'm also a customer. Sorry, I just love saying that. All right, let's finish up and just say that they do great work. And I had an awesome experience myself with them last fall, getting my own test, and the results were really illuminating for me. So head on over to InsideTracker.com to check out all of their testing kits. And don't forget, code STRENGTHRUNNING will save you 10% on any test they have available, including their affordable options. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Until next time.